Well, the calendar has changed to November. Fall back too. Time changed this past weekend. We're into November. Week 10 of the college football season has came and went. Had some shakeups in the top 10. Had one top 10 matchup this past weekend, Georgia versus Florida. A couple other top 10 teams had some tough road games, Utah and Washington. And 4 of the top 5 top 10 teams were off this past week. So not a whole lot of changes in this week's Uncle Lou top 10 poll, but there are going to be a few. Last week I started the playoff poll, so I had my first playoff poll out last week. Today we'll update that. This will be week 2 of the Uncle Lou playoff poll. Let's go. All right, good morning, and that's Uncle Lou here. Yep, that's right. It's me, Uncle Lou, live for you on LouTube today. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Also, in addition to that as well, subscribe to this channel if you're not already. I post college football videos almost every single day of the year. Some of them are even watchable. Not all of them, but some of them. I don't know about this one. You guys can let me know in the comments down below. All right, we're going to do it the same way we always do, right? I'll put last week's top 10 poll up on the screen. Now, this is the Uncle Lou poll. This isn't the AP or the coaches or anyone else's. This is just Uncle Lou's top 10. But I like to put it up on the screen as sort of reminder or as a reference point sort of where I was starting at when I got ready to put together this week's top 10 poll. So here you go. Here's last week's top 10. Obviously, as you can see there's going to be at least one major change. We'll go through it. I'm going to run through them 10 to 1. After I do 10 through 1, I'll talk a little bit about a few teams that I think are just on the outside of the Uncle Lou top 10. But let's get started with number 10 this week in the Uncle Lou poll, the Florida Gators. I thought long and hard about this. I didn't know really how far to drop Florida. I understand they have 2 losses, and in the end, that's what matters the most, wins and losses. I understand Florida has 2, and there are some undefeated teams, Power 5 undefeated teams, that aren't in the top 10. And some people are going to have some issues with that, and that's okay. There's going to be issues with anybody's top 10 poll. These are top 10 polls by nature are subjective, not objective. I can tell you, I just don't think Baylor or Minnesota, either one, are top 10 teams. I don't think. I definitely think there are at least 10 teams in America that are better than each of those 2 teams. Now, Baylor and Minnesota both will have an opportunity to prove Uncle Lou wrong. Baylor has Oklahoma coming up. They have Texas coming up. Minnesota's got Ohio State coming up. They've got Penn State coming up. So they'll have an opportunity to prove me and a lot of other people wrong. But for now, I'm keeping Florida at number 10. They do have 2 losses, but both of their losses are 2 teams that are still and currently and were at the time ranked within the top 10 when Florida played them. Of course, they lost to LSU. I think they lost that one by 2 scores. And they lost to Georgia by 1 score. Lost to LSU on the road, so at LSU. Lost to Georgia at a neutral site. As far as good wins for Florida, I guess the win over Auburn, probably their best win up to this point. They have a win over Miami, win over Kentucky, a win over South Carolina, a win over Tennessee, a win over a couple of lower classification schools. They don't have any bad losses, right? Losing to Georgia, losing to LSU. Those aren't considered bad losses. They didn't really get blown out in either one. They lost by 14 to LSU, but they were in that game through the 4th quarter. Lost by 7 to Georgia. So I honestly just feel like Florida is a top 10 team. I think they're better than the rest of the teams on their schedule. I would be surprised if they lost another game. They've got, who do they have? Missouri, Vandy, Florida State. Now, they've had some trouble with Missouri the last couple of years. We'll see. They get Vandy this week at home, and I think they play at Missouri. So, we'll see sort of how they handle that after being basically eliminated from the SEC East this past weekend. When they lost to Georgia, they would need Georgia to lose a couple of games, which is not likely to happen. But I've got Florida at number 10. I think the AP and the coaches poll came out yesterday. I think they were 10 in one of the polls and 11 in the other. And in the one that they were 11, I think they had Baylor number 10. Baylor struggled this past weekend to beat West Virginia at home, 17-14. West Virginia's not a very good team. I was impressed with Baylor defensively. Offensively, they didn't do that much. But again, Baylor's got games against teams like Oklahoma and Texas upcoming. They may end up having to play Oklahoma twice, which would give them 2 opportunities to get a quality win. But when you look at Oklahoma or at Baylor right now, in my mind, they don't have a win anywhere near as impressive as Florida's win against Auburn. Now, they also don't have any losses, and again, that has to count for something. If someone wants to have Baylor 10 and maybe push Florida out of the top 10, I would be okay with that. I don't really have an argument against that other than my personal opinion that I think Florida is just a better team than Baylor. Again, Baylor will have an opportunity, as will Minnesota, to prove a lot of people wrong or right, depending on which side of the fence you're on with those 2 teams. But I've got Florida this week at number 10. Number 9, Utah. I just moved them up a spot. Not an impressive win, but I guess a pretty good win on the road at Washington. Utah's under a lot of pressure. They have no more room for error. They're sitting on 1 loss. They control their own destiny in the Pac-12 South and in the Pac-12 as a whole, should they win the South. Them and Oregon are in the same boat. I moved Oregon up a spot too. Might as well just go ahead and say it. I've got Oregon at 8. So moved them each up a spot. They both won conference games on the road. Now, Oregon blew out Southern Cal. Utah beat Washington, I think it was 33-28. So didn't blow them out, but still 2 teams there, Oregon and Utah. They control their own destiny. They had to go on the road and play a conference game against teams that aren't terrible. Southern Cal, not terrible. Not nearly as good as they should be considering who they are. And Washington, not terrible, but a little bit disappointing this year. I think everyone would agree with that. But in any case, good wins. Were they great wins? No, but I think those are good wins, good enough to move up a spot considering one team ahead of them lost, that being Florida. Both Utah and Oregon still control their own destiny. And if they want any hope or shot at making a playoff, they've got to run the table. One of those 2 teams has to finish 12-1 with a Pac-12 title to even have a shot to get into the playoffs, in my opinion. We'll see if they can do it. We got a month left in the regular season, and then those 2 are probably going to meet in the Pac-12 title game. Best case scenario for the Pac-12 is that both those teams are 11-1 entering that Pac-12 title game. That would give whoever wins that game a really big win right before the last playoff poll comes out. Will that be enough to get the winner of that game into the playoffs? Maybe. Obviously, a lot of that's going to depend on what happens to teams ahead of them, but we'll talk a whole lot more about that, I'm sure, towards the end of regular season if both those teams do in fact finish with the 1 loss. So Florida 10, Utah 9, Oregon 8. I've got OU at 7. Now, they were on a bye this week, so no real chance to improve or hurt themselves this past week. I dropped them a spot from my poll from last week. Last week I had them at 6. This week I have them at 7. How can they drop a spot when they don't play? Well, the team right behind them in last week's poll, Georgia, or 2 spots behind them, Georgia, beat a top 10 team this past week. That's got to matter for something, right? I mean, I dropped Georgia out of my top 10 altogether when they lost to South Carolina. Here come the homer comments anyway. I think Georgia was ranked ahead of Oklahoma in both the AP and the coaches poll too. I'm pretty sure Georgia was 6th in both the AP and the coaches. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Those polls don't count. This one does. I've got OU 10, 9, 8, 7. I've got OU at 7. Now, OU shouldn't lose a game the rest of the year. They shouldn't have lost to Kansas State the first time. What do they have this week? They host Iowa State. Well, good thing they're not playing there. We all know you can't win a game on the road at Iowa State. If you don't believe me, find what's his name that has a YouTube channel. He's an Oklahoma fan, and he will take a year and a half or so to explain to you that you just can't win on the road at Iowa State. It's not an issue this year for Oklahoma as they get them at home. They should win that game. They should beat Baylor in a couple of weeks. They should win the Big 12 title game against no matter who they play. They're just clearly the best team in the Big 12. Is that loss to Kansas State going to hurt them so bad where they sort of end up stuck at the 5th spot in that final playoff poll? Again, a lot of that depends on what happens with teams around them the rest of the year. Be very interesting to see who would get in out of a 1-loss Oklahoma Big 12 champion versus, say, an Oregon out of the Pac-12. Would be interesting. What about a second SEC team? Anyway, we're going to have plenty of time to argue those things on down the road. I've got Oklahoma right now at number 7. Of course, that makes UGA number 6. Big win against Florida, 24-17. I already told you about Florida. I do think they're a top 10 team. That gives Georgia its 2nd win of the season against a team that was ranked in the top 10 when they played. The first one, of course, being Notre Dame. they're out of the top 10 now after catching a second loss to Michigan. And I think they're around 14 or 15 in the other two polls. So in any case, Georgia has 2 wins over current top 15 teams, Notre Dame and Florida. Oklahoma's best win is Texas. They're not ranked. Hard to find another good win, really, for Oklahoma this season. Now, they'll have some chances, like I mentioned, with Baylor and then a Big 12 title game. But I think right now, if you're being fair, you'd have to put Georgia ahead of Oklahoma. That's where I have them. We got UJ at 6. And, of course, that leaves the 5 major Power 5 teams that are still undefeated. And there was no reason for me to change the order of these top 5 after this past weekend. Only one of these top 5 teams played, so here you go. No changes in my top 5. Penn State 5, Clemson 4, Bama 3, LSU 2, and Ohio State 1. My thoughts and my explanations for why these teams are ranked in the order that they are, 1 through 5, I explained in ridiculous detail on last week's video. Basically, I think Ohio State is the best team that I've seen this year so far in college football. They haven't played even one bad game on either side of the ball. Both their offense and defense has come to play every single week. They appear to be one of the most complete teams in college football. Chase Young, defensive end, is the best player in college football. They've got a Heisman candidate at quarterback. They've got one of the best running backs in J.K. Dobbins. They've got NFL wide receivers. They've just looked, it seems like they have played at their best on both sides of the ball week in and week out. And they've got some quality wins. They have beat Wisconsin. They beat Michigan State. They beat Cincinnati. You might be laughing about that. I don't know. It's Cincinnati's only loss. Great wins. No, they'll have an opportunity for one against Penn State here in a couple of weeks. Maybe they see Wisconsin again in a Big 12 title game. We'll see. But right now, I think it's fair to have them at 1. I could also see an argument being made to have LSU at number 1. And to me, those are the only 2 teams that any poll should have at number 1. Either Ohio State or LSU. LSU, I think, has the best wins of any team in college football so far. They've got some really, really good wins. They've beat Florida. They've beat Auburn. They've beat Texas. I know Texas is unranked, but they're not a terrible team. I would put those 3 wins by LSU up against any other team's best 3 wins. So if someone wanted to put LSU number 1, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I've got them at 2. Again, doesn't matter that mumuch. We all know LSU and Alabama are playing this coming weekend. Whoever wins that game is going to be number 1 in every single poll, including mine, including the AP, including the coaches, including the playoff poll that comes out the following week after that. I mean, we all know that. So we shouldn't spend a whole lot of time debating right now LSU, Bama, and where they should be ranked, because one of those 2 teams is going to be ranked number 1 next week without question. The only question about Bama and LSU should be, how far does the loser fall? That depends on the score and that sort of thing. But I've got Ohio State 1, LSU 2, Bama 3, Clemson 4, Penn State 5. Penn State was on a bye. This week they play at Minnesota. Undefeated team. A chance for Penn State to have a good win. I'm not sold on Minnesota. I don't think they're a top 10 team or a playoff contender or anything like that. If they somehow beat Penn State, I think a lot of people are going to be forced to change their mind, maybe. Minnesota will definitely be a top 10 team if they beat Penn State this week. We'll see how far into the top 10 they can get. But this is their opportunity coming up this week. If you're a Minnesota fan, this is your chance. Prove everybody wrong this week by winning at home against Penn State. We'll see if it happens. Clemson, of course, beat the bejesus out of Wofford last week. And then they play at NC State this coming week. Bama, LSU, and Ohio State all had byes this past week. Bama plays, of course, host to LSU. LSU plays at Bama, and Ohio State is hosting Maryland. Ohio State will most likely win. Maryland's been a terrible team outside of their first 2 games this year. It would be a big surprise to everybody if Ohio State doesn't roll in that game. There are a few people, I think, who are still waiting on Ohio State to have that one head-scratching game that they've seemed to have the last couple of years against teams like a Purdue or an Iowa. If you've watched a lot of Ohio State this year, to me, this doesn't look like a team that's going to do that. I've been saying for a while, if Ohio State loses a game this year, it's going to have to be a good team that beats them. They're not going to slip up. Defensively, they had some issues the last couple of years, and that caught them in those 2 games, Iowa and Purdue. They don't have those issues this year. Their defense is top 5 for sure. Hard to imagine them slipping up against Maryland. Maybe Michigan can get hot and give them a game. I don't know. we've seen this movie before with Michigan heating up at the end of the year just to get waxed by Ohio State. Are we going to see it again? I don't know. If you're an Ohio State hater or wanting them to lose for some type of reason, that's probably your best bet at this point. Penn State, maybe. A Big 12 title game rematch against probably Wisconsin, maybe Minnesota, depending on how that goes. So, I don't know. We'll see. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to work itself out. LSU plays Bama, right? Ohio State plays Penn State. Oregon and Utah will eventually play. Georgia, even if they run the table with the one loss, is going to have to play either LSU or Bama in an SEC title game. So, a lot of this stuff will be worked out before the final playoff poll comes out. If I had to put my money right now on one team to make the playoffs, it would still be Clemson. I still think Clemson is the team, even though I've got them fourth. I think Clemson is the team on this list that is least likely to lose a regular season game, right? I mean, Ohio State's got some tough matchups with Michigan, Penn State, and then a Big 12 title game against either Wisconsin or Minnesota, right? LSU's got to play Bama and then probably Georgia in the SEC title game. Bama's got to play LSU, and if they win, probably Georgia in the SEC title game. Clemson's got literally nobody until the first round of the playoffs. So, even though Clemson is 4, it's making a lot of people mad. Defending champs, 15-0 last year, haven't lost a game this year. They feel kind of disrespected. Doesn't really matter. Clemson's getting into the playoffs. The chances of them losing a game are less, in my opinion, than the chances of any other team. So they're in the playoffs. It's just a matter of seeding for Clemson, in my opinion. And Penn State, of course, brutal schedule too with Ohio State, Minnesota, and then even if they win some of those and a Big 12 title game against Wisconsin or Minnesota again, most of those teams, if not all of them, are going to lose a game. So, don't get too upset if you're a Tater fan. Anyway, that's this week's Uncle Lou Top 10 poll. I appreciate you guys watching. Let me know down below, what would you switch up if you were doing the poll? Who should be 11th? That's always a popular debate or question I get asked every time I do a top 10 poll. Who would you have at 11? Probably Baylor. I would probably have Baylor at 11, maybe Minnesota after that. Being undefeated has to mean something, right? Michigan is heating up. You start talking about some of your 2-loss teams here, but Michigan, Notre Dame, Auburn maybe. I don't know. You guys let me know what you think. But I appreciate you guys watching. Have a good morning.